with consuming a healthier diet, of course you're going to experience some of the benefits of doing so. We've all felt that kind of rush that you get from having better food choices in your diet. You do feel better. Hello and welcome to another vlog on YouTube and podcast on Spotify by the Fit Minds podcast. Your host, Coach Mariah here again. If you would like to have somebody on the podcast, if you'd like me to interview somebody, feel free to send me a message with their name and I'll try and make it happen. I am very fussy with who I interview and for what reason though, but don't get me wrong, I do like interviewing people, but this one's going to be a solo podcast yet again. So today, let's chat about the misconception that healthy eating is simply going to lead to direct fat loss. And in that statement alone, it kind of sums up the whole concept in a nutshell. Generally, society would assume that making healthier choices is going to lead to an immediate or eventual rate of loss. You might have heard me discussing a calorie deficit in other podcasts, and sometimes this terminology can confuse people. I mean, why do we put numbers on food? Why do they have an energy value? And why do we need to care about what that value is in relation to our goals? Now, a large portion of people will start to tune out when I talk about a calorie deficit. But why is that? Because they have an aversion to numbers and think this concept is beyond their understanding. They don't want to track nor weigh their food, and they most certainly don't want to have to focus on being particular with certain amounts of things, portions, etc. So the aversion is not just to the numbers, but the effort required, which is perceived to be a little bit higher than what it actually is. Now, don't get me wrong, tracking your food and weighing your food and tracking numbers can be rather bothersome for somebody who has a very busy lifestyle, maybe a full-time working mum with multiple children, who may not have a partner as well to support them. But in essence, understanding that you need to be in a calorie deficit to lose body fat is the basics. That's where it begins. And these people, usually the ones that check out when I talk about a calorie deficit, are the ones that want to be told what to eat and when to eat it. And that method can work, but only temporarily, of course, especially if a person returns to old eating habits after taking direction from a meal plan prior, for example. Oftentimes, it's easier for people to avoid the truth than it is to actually implement what's required. And I've seen this a lot, that there are people who have quite literally dodged the idea of calories in, calories out, for decades. And they've jumped from lots of different fad diets to the next. The unfortunate truth is that none of these are going to work unless they facilitate a calorie deficit in general. In actual fact, it's not that hard to pay attention to whether or not you are eating in a calorie deficit, or calorie maintenance, or a calorie surplus. And even if a coach is determining that for you, it is possible for it to be done and for it to be something that is paid attention to. It's something that you are thinking about, or at least your coach is thinking about on your behalf. It's not too dissimilar to knowing how much fuel is in your tank in your car. Do you drive around not caring about that and just letting it run empty? No, it's something that you're aware of. The unfortunate truth, again, is that fat loss doesn't necessarily come down to the types of foods that we eat. And as much as what people try and force that type of concept, that it's the types of foods, that if they eliminate food groups of certain types, that they're going to lose body fat, it's still not going to change the fact that a calorie deficit is the actual way to lose body fat. Although the types of foods we can eat, yes, can have an influence on how many calories we are consuming, that's likely where people become lost and misled. So some food types have more calories than others, they're more calorie dense, and so they can get a bad rap or a bad name for themselves. Of course, making choices towards eating whole foods such as greens, whole grains, lean protein or lean meats, greens included in your fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy, and a wide variety of fruit and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and natural good fats. This can be incredibly beneficial for our overall health and, of course, keeping us fuller for longer. We know that whole foods, they have a higher satiation than what highly processed foods do because, quite simply, they are the whole version of that food, the original version, and something that has a potential to fill us up for much longer. Where we have to draw the line though is understanding the difference between eating clean and eating in a calorie deficit. Okay, you can still eat clean and be in a calorie deficit, but eating clean doesn't mean it's exclusive to being in a calorie deficit. And that's not as confusing as it might seem when I explain a little bit later in the podcast. I actually just commented on a thread in a group on Facebook today. A woman was asking whether or not she should continue to follow a keto diet, engage in a calorie deficit, or eliminate a food group to ensure she was losing body fat. Yes, people still ask these questions. I also answered a message recently which asked what the most ideal exercises were for burning body fat. Now, this is not to call people out. People still believe that there are particular food groups we need to eliminate to burn body fat, or particular exercises that are better for burning body fat. Now, if you do choose to listen to the rest of this podcast, it's going to give you some insight into why you probably might be a little bit frustrated that your healthy eating habits and choices might not be adding up for you towards the fat loss goals that you have. If you choose to tune out and stop the podcast because you don't want to listen to me rattle on about a calorie deficit again, that's okay too. But don't be disappointed when you return to those healthy eating habits and don't achieve the results that you want. There is no sort of other magical reason or justification as to why you're not losing body fat if you are not currently tracking your calories, macros, at least portions, or weighing your food. Even with a meal plan, you're going to have portions recommended to you and weighed amounts recommended to you. No, we cannot blame our hormones or genetics or any other sort of unicorn rainbow or logical explanation. The matter of the fact is that nutrition practice is determined by both science and maths. And food is obviously rather complex because there is just so much variety and choice out there available for us, now more than ever. I think where people go wrong is that they try to simplify it, by the elimination of food groups, for example, but then strangely overcomplicate it as a result. In actual fact, every single piece of food that you pick up will have an energy value to it. For example, spinach leaves have roughly 10 calories per cup. I don't really like using cup measurements, but it's one thing for people to understand from a volume perspective. A cup of spinach leaves is 10 calories, roughly. A calorie, to understand what that is a unit of measure that has been used for decades to measure the amount of energy that a food contains. We figured this out by performing multiple tests on food items to figure out what energy value was in that food. And I believe one of them was a combustion method, so burning it and measuring the carbon dioxide, I think, that came off of it. There's some fascinating methods we've used over the years to understand energy balance, and this is how we basically developed modern nutrition today. So plenty of research, has gone into the science. Plenty of research. If you think that, sciences such as brain surgery or, heart surgery or really complex immunology issues have been studied, so has nutrition, and this is where we've got to. And obviously there are more complex types of topics than calories in, calories out, but this seems to be something that majority of the population struggle with. The reason why we found it easier to put a number value to food as an energy source is because we actually expend energy in a similar way as a numerical value. So not only does a food contain an energy value, but we also expend energy from the body as a numerical value. So that's how we figured this out. Mostly as heat, the energy expended from the body when we move and breathe, etc. Now there are other types of energy that we use, like muscular energy or the biomechanical energy, but it's not actually as drastic as we would think. But basically, energy can be measured, the energy that we expend. Yes, we can burn body fat and we can use energy from food, which all contains energy values. So the body fat on your body currently contains energy that you can use to expend from your body, Now we can understand that concept. Our body fat itself contains energy values per individual cell of body fat that we burn, So there's tiny little cells of adipose tissue and we burn into those if we're in a calorie deficit. So now you're starting to understand that body fat contains spare energy. We can burn energy from both food and fat stores, and we can also consume, we can eat energy, So you imagine it's kind of like, it's this up and down process of energy balance. If we have consumed too many calories and too much energy in the way of calories in a day versus the amount of energy that our body has used, we don't have anywhere to put that energy. So this is what our body fat stores are for, okay? This is what happens when we have an excess of energy that we've consumed. I've used the analogy of the glass of water before. We have a glass of water, and if we fill it to the top, that's our maintenance calories. Let's say, for example, we drink that whole glass of water and then we fill it back up again the next day. Then we drink it again and then we fill it back up again the next day, and so on. At the same frequency, okay? So nothing has changed except for this filling it up to the top and drinking it again, and filling it up to the top and drinking it again every day. You can see how this allows there to be no water spilling over the cup, but no water left in the cup either. So if you're eating at a calorie maintenance and your energy expenditure stays the same for the day, your body doesn't really have the opportunity to tap into your stored energy, your body fat, okay? So this is why maintenance sees you stay the same weight, same body composition usually. A calorie surplus is when we pour more water into the glass than the glass can hold. So we are pouring it and it's spilling over. The additional water spills over the edges and maybe into, say, a bowl, a catchment, which we could say is going to be the storage system for body fat. Okay, so we actually have something that catches the extra energy, which is a storage system for body fat. A calorie deficit would entail pouring some water into the cup, but leaving a small gap at the top. And it doesn't have to be a drastic gap. You know, the gap is, it's a gap. We still have enough food to function, but we leave a gap. Which means that this gives our body an opportunity to use some of the stored body fat in the bowl, the storage, beneath the cup for our energy requirements for the day, okay? So this is starting to make sense, right? Now you're kind of getting this analogy, and there's lots of different analogies we can use. Obviously, the water in the cup represents our food intake, and the additional water left over in the bowl, pouring over the cup, or kept in the bowl because it's not leaving the bowl anytime soon, represents our body fat stores. So the real issue at hand involves the idea that a lot of the time when we do make healthy food choices, we're not necessarily tracking or measuring the amount of these foods that we're consuming. And this is where our energy value can sometimes sit at maintenance or in an excess of what energy we require for the day, spilling over the cup. This can sometimes happen in an accidental and non-purposeful way. So it's important to understand that you're not a bad person because you're not dropping body fat and you're eating really healthily. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, so to speak, but it just means you're not doing it effectively or not in a way that's facilitating fat loss. For example, it might be that you are using cooking oil and not measuring how much you're putting into the pan. You know, you're just kind of spraying it and going, all right, cool, I'll do that with every meal. Or maybe you're putting tablespoons of oil into things. It could be that you view coconut oil as a healthy fat, but you're using a larger amount or even using it frequently throughout the day, which is bumping up your calories. It could be that you're not measuring how much peanut butter you're using or eating a handful of nuts, but not necessarily knowing just how many nuts you've consumed or even how many grams of nuts you're consuming. You've just estimated a handful, which can vastly differ in caloric content, whether it's a small handful or a big handful. Or eating a big bowl of rice or quinoa and not necessarily taking into account exactly how much you would require to meet a certain energy value for that meal. Okay, so you know, maybe you're having cups and cups of rice instead of having a particular portion, maybe half a cup of rice, or maybe you're just free pouring rice because you feel like that amount. No, it's not a coincidence that the food types I've suggested above mostly fall into the category of fats, aside from rice and quinoa, because quinoa is a seed, I believe. And obviously it's possible to overconsume macronutrient groups, other ones, including carbohydrate and proteins. So it's not just fats to blame, obviously, but fats usually are the one that are very easy to go over because why? For the amount of room that they take up, for the space that they take up, they're very calorie dense. So they have a lot of energy for a very small amount of food. And obviously it is possible to overconsume, lots of different types of food that will contain lots of different types of macros. So I'm not saying that you can't overconsume your food by, eating candy, which is mostly carbohydrates. But sometimes if we're eating healthy and we assume we're eating healthy and we're eating in a calorie deficit, it will be those fats that generally are the culprit for the reason why we're not eating in a deficit. For example, you might think that you're eating a really healthy meal because you're eating a big portion of salmon, but we know that the skin on salmon is very dense in calories because of the high fat content. So a portion of skin on salmon is going to be higher in calories than, say, a portion of chicken breast. And you're not to know that until you learn, right? That chicken breast is lower in fats and salmon is higher in fats. And so for the portion, especially if the salmon has skin, or even if the chicken has skin, it's going to have a higher calorie content because it has a higher fat content. It doesn't mean that the salmon is bad for you, but it just means that it contains a higher energy value and we need to account for that. So if you're going to eat salmon, you've got to understand how many calories you're consuming versus another type of meat. Obviously, healthy fats are not bad for you. This is not me saying they're bad for you. And I think a lot of people mistake the concept of fat loss and what we consume for a fat loss, a calorie deficit, is that, energy dense foods that have lots of energy and calories are automatically bad for us then. And that's not how this works. It just means it contains a higher energy value and we need to consider it, okay? We have to stop thinking in a black and white fashion in order to truly understand the nutrition. That nutrition is not that simple, but it's also not super complex either. At least not when understanding an energy value in foods. In that, just because something is good for you doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't contain energy, and it may also contain a larger energy value than another food type. And by the same token, foods we may deem as bad for us, like junk foods, etc., processed foods, they contain an energy value as well, but it doesn't mean that they're bad for fat loss either. It may be that there are foods which are sometimes, going to be more calorie dense, but it doesn't mean we have to cut them out altogether to ensure that we're burning body fat. And we really need to stop assuming carbs, like bread or pasta, are evil too, as they actually fall more into food groups which can be beneficial for micronutrients, our health, and our energy. So it's important to be wary of these energy-dense food types and foods in general to understand appropriate portion control for these. And sometimes, actually most of the time, I've noticed that when people are accidentally over-consuming their calories, it is usually in the way of liquid calories, such as drinks containing energy values, maybe like juice, for example, where a person doesn't feel full after having them. Added sugar to coffees, sauces, extra fats untracked added to meals, condiments not measured, weighed, or accounted for. Even things like, mayonnaise and all sorts of types of dressings even can add up over time. And if you are eating out quite a lot and you're having a lot of these different types of toppings and added oils to meals as well because they taste nice, the meal can look healthy to the eye, but unfortunately the calories can rack up. Not all sauces are created equally. For example, mustard is notorious for being a bit lower in calories, whereas mayonnaise is notorious for being a bit higher. And this is generally down to the fact that one type of sauce might contain more fats and even more sugar, as well as more fats than the other. Do you see where I'm getting with this? It's just a matter of seeing things less emotionally and less aggressively, and in less extremes. Understanding that every single food item, as I said, contains an energy value and we need to respect that. And on top of that, there are different brands of food items that will contain vastly different calories to the next. So you could have a low-fat mayonnaise and a mayonnaise that is a whole egg mayonnaise, high-fat mayonnaise, and they're going to be vastly different in caloric content. Some foods are going to be particularly low in calories for the volume that they take up. For example, as I mentioned earlier, spinach leaves are only 10 calories per cup, which is crazy to think. Considering a cup of peanut butter is going to contain a massive 550 calories, right? So that's the energy value. And if you think about that, 10 calories, we're probably going to use that up walking for, I'm going to say maybe a minute. I'm not sure if that's even accurate, maybe a couple of minutes. But 550 calories, that's going to take a lot more. That's a big leg session. That's like 2 hours of training legs for a female. So, both of those foods are considered health foods. They're considered good for us. And absolutely, they are. But they have different energy values for the amount of volume that they take up. So a cup of spinach versus a cup of peanut butter. Now you understand why fats are so calorie dense. And what's really interesting is the calories can differ again depending on the brand of food item, as I mentioned. So again, in peanut butter, not just mayonnaise, but peanut butter. You could have one peanut butter that has a higher calorie content than the other, and it just comes down to the ingredients used in the peanut butter. For example, bread is also a great one to reference. We often assume that bread is really high in calories, and therefore we need to cut it out of our diet. But there are lots of different brands of bread, for example, that might range from 100 calories for 2 slices to 100 calories for 1 slice alone. So that's 200 calories for 2 slices, so double the calories. It depends on everything from the thickness of the bread to the ingredients used in the bread to be able to reach that energy value. This is why nutrition labels can be really handy when we're at the shops. Sometimes it's smart to look at what the total calories are per 100 gram if you're looking at something that you're going to portion out, or what the total calories are per serving if you're going to stick to the serving size. The key is keeping in mind, most of the time people don't stick to serving sizes, so it's important to understand nutritional labels and what's contained in the serving that you're actually going to eat. The harsh reality is that you will need to understand and accept is the fact that a calorie deficit is the only way to burn body fat. And if you're asking the question, how do I establish whether I'm eating in a calorie deficit or not? The first thing you need to understand is that if you're not losing body fat currently, you're probably not eating in a calorie deficit. Or maybe the deficit set for you isn't low enough. Maybe you're not as active as you need to be to ensure that you are burning energy or enough energy to keep you in a calorie deficit and access your body fat stores as energy. Maybe your training at the gym is a little bit lackluster and the sessions aren't necessarily pushing your heart rate high enough or for long enough towards burning enough energy either. Maybe you're going in and doing a 15-minute session, you're stretching and you're leaving, and that's probably not burning a ton of calories. Not saying you have to be there for 3 hours, because we know that the energy burnt in sessions has a lot less of an impact than the energy consumed for the day, but at least understanding that this will have some influence on your total energy balance for the day. Usually, the main culprit is going to be the fact that you are just eating too many calories or drinking in the day for your goals to lose body fat. So maybe it's both together. You don't just blame the consumed calories that you're drinking. So it's important for you to work with a professional to establish what your calorie deficit might be. It is our job to calculate this, work it out for you, to then work for you on your journey. As much as what it might seem like it takes effort or time or money, it's a far better alternative to spinning your wheels and going around in circles, and maybe you've been wasting money on supplements as well. The other component of being in a calorie deficit is that your body will eventually adapt to lower calories over time as a survival mechanism. If you have been dieting for quite some time and you know that you are consuming calories in a deficit, and maybe you've got some symptoms of severe fatigue and you're starting to get some issues with sleep, etc., you might need to reference why, you need to take a diet break, which I've spoken about in another podcast. Especially if you've been dieting on lower calories for 8 to 12 weeks and beyond. Maybe your body needs a little bit of a break on maintenance calories to give your metabolism a chance to chill out and incur some metabolic repair. This is basically just a process to allow for your body to de-stress from the prolonged periods of time of dieting, and then give it another shot at dieting after you've taken that diet break. But again, I won't talk too much about diet breaks because this podcast is focused on healthy eating versus eating in a calorie deficit, and we don't want to digress. It's totally okay if you start to make choices for yourself, which includes increasing your whole grains, fruit and vegetable intake, switching over your protein sources to lower fat meals and low fat dairy, for example, and consuming more water. And with consuming a healthier diet, of course, you're going to experience some of the benefits of doing so. We've all felt that kind of rush that you get from having better food choices in your diet. You do feel better. Benefits of an increase in micronutrient and variety intake as well. Improved immune function, overall health, improved digestion with the increase in fiber from plant-based sources. Feeling fuller for longer because maybe you're eating enough protein now that you've incorporated some of those lean protein sources into your diet, and maybe you've experienced benefits like your skin consistency and texture improving since incorporating some healthy fats. This podcast is not designed to speak poorly of healthy eating, and again, it's not black and white. We don't take this all or nothing approach when it comes to nutrition. But it's important to understand the balance of eating well, eating healthy, and ensuring that you are consuming foods at an amount that guarantees that you are in a state of caloric deficit. It's going to be the key to success with your fat loss goals. Each person's caloric deficit or calorie deficit is going to be rather different from the next. It could quite literally range from, yes, as low as 1,200 calories to 1,300 calories, but only for a woman who is shorter, maybe doesn't move as much, and may not have as much body fat to lose, okay? And also weighs less. Up to 4,000 calories could be somebody else's deficit, even more than that as well. Maybe for a taller, heavier male that works in an active laboursome role and has high activity levels, and there are just some people who seem to chew through food faster than other people, and those are just usually a small percentage of the population who are genetic freaks with their calorie deficit. It's also important to note that the more we weigh, the more calories that our body will use naturally. So it's crucial not to assume that just because you have a fair amount of body fat to lose, that you will need to eat as little as possible. For people who might have 20 or 30 kilos of body fat to lose to get to a healthier body fat percentage, you'd be surprised that your calorie deficit is not going to be as low as you might think. It's like carrying around a 20 or 30 kilo backpack. It takes energy to carry that weight around too. And you shouldn't be engaging in a calorie deficit that is too low for you, because oftentimes this is just too difficult for you to stick to. And this is where we can see that you're over-consuming your calories again by accident. So this is probably more common, is that some people take their calorie deficit too far, too quickly, and unfortunately they end up having snackcidents. Calorie deficits are designed for each individual person, and it is my job as a coach and nutritionist to work with clients in establishing their deficit, the accuracies, for example, tracking their own food and measuring food accurately. And also ensuring that there is an awareness around the fact that just because we make healthy food choices when we are eating out, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to keep us in a calorie deficit either. Oftentimes, trying to reduce as many of these meals out as possible is important for taking advantage of the window of opportunity that you may have given yourself to achieve a fat loss goal. So I'm not a Nazi and I'm not saying don't eat out ever again, but when you're trying to lose body fat and you want to do it in a specific amount of time, sometimes it's actually more worth it to just go without the takeaway meals for that period of time and making them at home. Or sometimes you can find some places that do have tracked items on the menu that you can look up in MyFitnessPal, like Grilled or Subway, for example. The more that you drag out the process though, and avoid tracking, measuring, or even portioning out your food, working with a professional, the more that you are going to meet the same obstacles over and over and over again. Don't get me wrong, making healthy food choices and estimating amounts for food items is not necessarily a terrible approach when it comes to maintaining our results. So that's if you don't want to lose body fat and you're happy with where you are. Once we've achieved the result, the flexible eating and the intuitive eating can absolutely come into place, and I've done a podcast about that as well. But it is important to acknowledge that you cannot cheat the nutritional system of science or the maths behind caloric intake, energy value, energy expenditure, and each person's requirement differing from one person to the other. That's it from me. I'm looking forward to doing another podcast for you soon. Thanks a lot. Bye.